Hello, and welcome back to Missouri's Civil War. Today we begin our second week by considering some of the major decisions that Missourians faced in 1860 and 1861. Two of these decisions came in the elections of 1860, when voters cast their lot for a new governor and president. In both cases, Missourians showed a strong inclination toward preserving the status quo. In the year's closing weeks, other pivotal decisions confronted Missourians. Thousands of volunteers mobilized for military action, and tensions along the state line to the west threatened to erupt into open warfare with Kansans. First, Missourians' 1860 gubernatorial election came in August, months before the scheduled presidential election. These elections came after a decade of dramatic change. The 1848 discovery of gold in California lured starry-eyed Missourians westward. An even larger number, though, passed through the state, and this left many shops and farms in Missouri flush with cash. Population continued to increase, pushing the number of Missouri residents past 1 million. The growth of St. Louis was especially striking, especially since the Great Fire of 1849 had destroyed much of the old city. The population nearly doubled during the 1850s, and it now represented 1/6 of the entire state's total. St. Louis was the nexus of its rapidly expanding rail network. In the 1850s, Missouri spent more on rail construction than any other state, building 900 miles of track. This expansion, however, slowed with the Panic of 1857, and said one anxious mother, "Times were never so hard. Money is scarce, and labor is scarcer." The contest to succeed Democratic incumbent Governor Robert Stewart was a four-man race, like the presidential contest that would follow. In both cases, the Democratic Party divided into two factions. The so-called Douglas Democrats took their name from Stephen Douglas, Illinois Democrat. In Missouri, they nominated Claiborne Fox Jackson, a former state legislator and a member of the powerful Central Clique that I described last time. Other Missouri Democrats rallied behind Hancock Jackson, who supported the Southern Democratic ticket of John C. Breckinridge. Third, Sample Orr, a farmer and lawyer from southwest Missouri, became the gubernatorial nominee of the Constitutional Union Party. And finally, James B. Gardenhire stood atop the ticket of the new Republican Party. Although Claiborne Jackson endorsed the Northern Democrat for president, mostly to court the support of St. Louis voters, his latent sympathies lay with the slaveholding South. As a resident of Little Dixie, he had long been a bellwether for pro-slavery Missourians. He was the namesake of the 1849 Jackson Resolutions, in which Missouri legislators urged their U.S. senators to protect slavery and to help spread it into the West. As historian Christopher Phillips has said, Claib Jackson was a skillful, calculating political chameleon. He managed to be a little bit of everything to everyone. He won that election to become Missouri's next governor by taking 47% of the votes statewide. He won 70 counties, finished respectably in 35 others. Second place went to Sample Orr. And together, these two candidates won more than 90% of the votes. The Southern Democrat Hancock Jackson trailed far behind with barely 11,000 votes, and Gardenhire, the Republican, won only 6,000, most of them in St. Louis. Whether you choose to call the voters in this border state conservative or moderate, Missourians exhibited a clear rejection of partisan sectional extremes. They tried to hew a path straight down the middle, and this proved true in the presidential election. Missouri became the only state to give all of its electoral votes to the Northern Democrat Stephen Douglas. He took the state by a razor-thin margin of 429 votes. As the architect of popular sovereignty, he was someone to whom Missourians looked in their effort to spread slavery after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Douglas just edged John Bell, the Constitutional Union nominee. And if you're wondering, what is this Constitutional Union outfit? I don't recall hearing them run before or ever since. You're right, they didn't. The Constitutional Union Party was a one-off creation, mostly consisting of border state residents who found themselves without a political home. Some were conservatives, former Whigs, whose party had disappeared after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and people who could not bring themselves to vote Republican. Instead, they tried to cobble together a new national party that would, as the name suggested, rally to the Constitution ahead of divisive politics surrounding slavery. They failed to capture any national offices in 1860, and they soon disbanded, and so it's a one-time phenomenon. John C. Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, finished a distant third in Missouri, but he did better than Hancock Jackson had in the gubernatorial race. Presidential nominee Abraham Lincoln won the national election by sweeping the northern states. Southern critics charged that Lincoln was a strictly sectional candidate, that he was only popular in the North, and that his interests were hostile to that of the slave-owning South, despite the candidate's pledge not to touch slavery where it presently existed. But it's worth noting at this point that even if the votes of the other three candidates had been combined and put to a single challenger, Lincoln still would have won the electoral votes needed to become president. In many Missouri counties, as in much of the South, Lincoln's name did not even appear on the ballot. In places where it did, intimidation reduced the turnout even more because local men suggested that Republican voters ought to, quote, make themselves scarce, end quote, on Election Day. The weeks after Lincoln's election saw the secession of South Carolina and 6 other states in the Deep South. In early 1861, these states would form the new Confederate States of America. 8 states, however, in the Upper South and Border South remained within the Union. 2 elections now had shown Missourians' distaste for anti-slavery politics from New England, but also for the fire-breathing extremism of the Deep South. By year's end, the writings of newly elected Governor Claiborne Jackson, however, belied his previous moderation. He wrote, "Can we not regard Lincoln's election as anything less than a declaration of war upon the whole slave property of all the Southern states? Is it not a moral dissolution of the Union?" And later he noted, "The destiny of the slaveholding states of the Union is one and the same." Missouri remained within the Union, but with such sympathies, its place within the Union was hardly secure. And one quick aside, an interesting comparison between Lincoln and Jackson. Claiborne Jackson styled himself as an anti-Lincoln, but like Abe Lincoln, he was elected clean-shaven. After they both win, they each decided to grow out their whiskers. Maybe they decided it carried a certain kind of gravitas. I don't know. After Lincoln's election and the secession of South Carolina, Missourians braced themselves for an uncertain future. Volunteer militias began to take shape and to drill across the state. Even as most Missourians had shown themselves to be politically neutral or moderate, most of these Home Guard units became conspicuously pro-Union or pro-secession. In St. Louis, where half of the residents were now foreign-born, the largest number were of German descent. The so-called Turner Clubs had previously been gymnastics or athletic organizations. They now required military training for all 500-plus members. These Turner Clubs were one in a long line of volunteer militias in the city, going back to the 1830s. Many of these were social clubs with names like the St. Louis Grays, the Montgomery Guards, the Washington Blues. Yet now in the fraught secession winter of 1860, they assumed a more martial dimension. In the final month of 1860, the outgoing governor, Robert Stewart, called upon such militias to help with a worsening crisis on the western border. The territorial government in Kansas had long since been controlled by the Free State faction, dashing the hopes of Missouri slave owners. But irregular partisan violence still raged along the state line. In 1858, pro-slavery men under Charles Hamilton, many of them Missourians, executed several free soil settlers just across the Kansas line in what became known as the Meridazine Massacre. Later that year, John Brown returned to the West and conducted raids into Missouri to liberate about a dozen slaves, killing one slave owner. Free soil guerrillas known as Jayhawkers murdered several men from Missouri, some for their pro-slavery politics, some for horse theft, others for their part in kidnapping fugitive slaves and returning them to slavery in Missouri. When Jayhawker Captain James Montgomery declared his intention to take this war against slavery into Missouri, once all of the pro-slavery foes had been cleared from Kansas, residents of western Missouri counties appealed to the governor for help. Robert Stewart responded to these fears by calling upon volunteer militias to defend the state border, and he's now weeks away from leaving office. Companies from every corner of the state, from Cape Girardeau in the southeast to St. Joseph in the northwest, offered to take up arms to repel this Jayhawker. But Stewart dispatched a brigade of state militia under Daniel Frost to the border in the upper Osage River Valley. This so-called Southwest expedition traveled west from St. Louis as far as the railroad could take them, and they then marched 70-plus miles through the snow. Frost found that a great many farmsteads in western Missouri had been abandoned. Families had fled the guerrilla violence and abandoned the state altogether. Charged with strictly defensive orders, the militiamen did not cross into Kansas, but instead waited for weeks to see if Montgomery and his men carried out their threats. When the invasion never materialized, Frost's men returned to St. Louis, where they were greeted as heroes. Missourians thus avoided open war with their neighbor to the west. By year's end, the mobilization of volunteer militia continued. The governor-elect remained steadfast in his hostility toward the new Republican administration in Washington. In early 1861, Missourians would decide once again where their fate lay, within or outside of the Union. For next time, we consider that decision and its implications for the fateful days that followed. Until then.